This week in creative writing, I'm asking you to develop a piece of short fiction. And so to make that narratively manageable, I want you to think about this perhaps as a scene or a point of interaction between a character in the world or a few characters, to break it down and to make it editable for the assignment. First, we need to define scene itself. Scene is a distinct moment of interaction between characters with each other and or their world. So you're thinking about this as a distinct moment in time where there's something specifically at stake here. So you want to explore the central tensions that are there. Some questions to think about as you write and edit here are who and what is in conflict or in contention within the scene. What's at stake there? What's the character the central character trying to gain or trying to win? And how do characters negotiate those basic tensions of the scene to define themselves? I've included a few examples from films with this as well on the site, so you might want to take a look at those and think about those basic questions as you look at the scenes being described by their directors. What's at stake in each of those scenes, and how is the character trying to negotiate the tensions that are in the basic conflicts within the scene. Some basic kind of craft issues to think about in the scene. First of all, you want to define the scene's point of view clearly. You want to be consistent within point of view within it. That is, you want to tell it in first person or third person here. Don't move back and forth between first and third. You want to be clear about what characters can know about each other, given your choice with point of view. What the narrative itself or the author can know about the characters as things develop, and what points of narrative distance are present within the telling itself. What points of description or setting are necessary to that particular point of view or perspective? Is this going to be a sense in which a character is describing a world that is very kind of internalized, so it's a very kind of distinct world that's understood through a particular character's knowledge and inner world? Or is it kind of, you set the camera a little further out from the character so that the character is interacting with others in a larger world there? What can the characters know of themselves or one another here? And think about how that not knowing, what they don't know about each other, may be a tension within the scene itself. Overall, think about how you develop the characters within the scene. That is, how the character knows him or herself, how the character knows the world around him or her, or how the character knows others within the scene. The attempt to know those others or to know that world may itself set up the conflict that drives the scene for you in the writing. The basic question that I talked a little bit about in terms of character itself is what the character wants there may set up the conflict. The character may want to know something of the world or others, and what is the character willing to trade to know that or to possess that thing in the end. The character's internal world is an important part of how you set up the scene here. That is, how the character is thinking about that world or putting that world together piece by piece, how the character builds that larger world but does it internally. So you can narrate the character's immediate perceptions, sense data, what the character smells, feels, tastes or touches, the character's basic feelings, particularly estimations of place within that immediate scene. You can also think about the character's memory here. Don't be afraid to go into a moment of flashback within the scene for a half page to a page within your writing, where the character remembers a particular interaction with the world or other characters as he or she tries to figure out what's going on in this immediate moment. Also think about the context for the scene itself, particularly if you're imagining this as a particular moment within a larger narrative or maybe novel. What's the larger setting for the scene? I've given you some film examples here. Not only about the piece itself, but also like the place that it's in. So is this a small town in the American South? The setting, is this another planet? Is this a future Gary that is, is 1,000 years from now? Think about how the scene needs to be kind of set to clarify the story. How does the scene fit within the beginnings or endings of a larger story here? So if you were going to take a piece of autobiography and develop it fictionally, perhaps, how does that story fit within what's happened to a character before, or what's happened to a character, or what will happen to a character after this scene? So think about beginnings or endings here and how the scene fits into a larger narrative of the character. You can also think about historical and social context for the story. How does the historical moment of the social conventions that surround the character define the scene and the points of conflict or interaction that are there? If you're narrating a story from Gary in the early 20th century, how does that work against narrating a scene that may be set in Gary in the late 20th or early 21st century here? And you can also think about aspects of genre here as context. That is, like, if you're telling a horror story or a fantasy story, a romance story, how do the conventions of telling there shape your scene as well? And then finally, editing the scene. A few things to think about as you go back through the scene. First, again, establish a consistency within point of view. Also, think about the development of characters here. One note about characters is that you don't have to make every character round and full here. That you may have a narrator or a character you're closest to within the center of the story that's very kind of well developed in terms of his or her emotional world and inner world. But the other characters within the story can be very flat as well, that you need a mix of round and flat characters. Some characters who don't have a lot of dimensions to them. They're very clearly defined by just maybe a few characteristics. Similarly, not all characters have to change within the story. Some characters need to be static or not change in the story because you want the dynamic characters or the rounded characters to define themselves against those flat and unchanging characters in that world. As you edit, be sure to clarify or heighten the conflict, even if the conflict's internal. You don't have to have violence for the conflict. All you need is that kind of internal struggle that the character might feel in finding a place within that world or defining a place in a relationship with someone else. And finally, within your editing, be sure to sharpen the language as much as you can. Cut any unnecessary or cliched language or points of description. Think about what details are essential to the scene itself, what basic kind of props, if you were thinking about this as a stage play, what things would need to be on the stage to make the scene work in the end.